Carry On Only, dedicated to inspiring your next global adventure. And now, here's your host and personal guide, award-winning photographer, creative director, and travel expert, taking you around the world in style, Jill Pater.
I'm your host, Kevin, along with my colleague, Sam.
Hello.
We are here with Jill Pater. How's it going, Jill?
It's going well, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Jill today is going to take us on a little journey to Provence, France. She travels extensively for work, so we're excited to hear all of the good stuff that Jill has to tell us today about her travels for work, for pleasure. She is kind of our resident expert. Jill, what was the first thing that brought you to Provence? Why did you want to go there?
Well, one of my great friends goes there yearly and spends 3 to 4 months there a year. And I had met her and she said, we're going to Provence and in September, you should come. And I said, okay, great. And booked my ticket. And it was an amazing experience. I had been to France many of times. I did an immersion French program in Paris for 6 months at one point, but I had never really spent time in the south of France in Provence. And so I went. She had found me this amazing B&B in a castle on a property in Provence. A castle,
amazing.
Yes, yeah. So it was pretty. It was
worst places to stay.
It was pretty hard not to like. And the great thing about Provence is it's huge. It's relatively big. It's mostly country, but you have a few smaller cities in it, and it's just a very relaxing place to spend time. And so every time you go to Provence, it's one of those places that you can have a unique experience every time. I've been back 3 or 4 times, and every time we visit small towns, we have new food experiences. We work on new projects together.
So you went for work, or was it for pleasure?
The first time was for pleasure, and then we ended up going back. We shot a book called Cuisine Libre, which is a monograph book on a Michelin-starred restaurant in France called La Fenière.
Nice. So since you've been a couple of times, how long do you recommend spending there?
I would say as for most European trips, if you're traveling from the U.S., I always recommend 10 days at a minimum to 2 weeks. Obviously, the longer you can spend, the better. Yeah, I would say the minimum with 10 days, just with the travel, getting used to the time zone. Provence is a place you'll fall in love with, so you could easily spend a couple of months there. So it really depends on your...
It was like 10 days.
So a 5-day getaway is not enough.
No, definitely not. Especially in places where you're relaxing, because once you start kind of taking things down, time goes very quickly.
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
So Provence is definitely a place that you would travel again to?
Yes, in fact, we'll be going there again in a couple weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, there.
I did not get the invite.
Right, same.
Yes.
I absolutely did not.
We're still waiting for those in our mailbox.
Yes.
So you're going at this time of the year. What other times of the year have you gone to Provence?
I've typically gone at this time. This is my favorite time of year. So September, so kind of after the tourist season, September, October is my personal favorite time.
So this is low budget travel season?
I wouldn't say it's low budget. It's still an ideal time weather-wise. It's shoulder season, so things are a little bit...
Shoulder season?
Yeah.
That's my time of season.
Yeah. Things are a little bit less, and you don't have the mass tourism, especially, in some of these key places, things can be like triple the cost. When everybody has vacation, when kids are out of school, things tend to be pretty, but most of Europe tends to go down after August. August is the month that most Europeans take off. So come mid-September, people are kind of back in the swing of things.
Yeah.
And it's just an absolutely beautiful time to visit. The weather's perfect. It's still quite warm.
So for a place like Provence, were you inspired to go there, or was it because you, as you mentioned, you had a friend who was, trying to get you to go out there, or is it just you knew of it, it's beautiful, and you wanted to go?
I had certainly known of it, and her interest in it, because it's a place that she had spent a lot of time. It definitely inspired me to go, and having friends there is key. Provence is a place where, you definitely want to rent a car. It's quite large. There isn't great transportation throughout the region. If you fly into the cities, if you fly into Marseille, or you're spending time in Aix-en-Provence proper, there's transportation around those areas and trains throughout the rest of the country.
Is it an easy train ride from, say, Paris, to get to Provence?
To get to Marseille, it is, and to get to Aix-en-Provence, it's a fairly easy train ride. It's just if you're traveling around the region to see some of the highlights, you definitely want a car.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would assume most people probably seek out to go to Paris first and then, try to find their way to Provence.
Yes.
Definitely good to know. So when you were there, was it just, I hope it wasn't all work.
No, never.
Peppered some play in there.
Never, Kevin.
So what were you up to? Were you shooting? Were you, going on location? Like what all were you doing while there?
The first time I went there, I used it as kind of a shoulder trip before I was teaching in London. So it was just a very easy flight. So I spent 10 days there and then flew up to London to teach. The second time, my friend and I, we had put together a pitch for a book on the Michelin-starred restaurant that I had mentioned, La Fenière. And so when we went back, we shot for about a week at the restaurant, and then the rest of the time was playtime.
Playtime is good time.
Yeah, like speaking of like what you shot, like what was your favorite things to photograph there? Was it the people, the architecture, like the landscapes? Like what was your favorite thing?
The landscapes are definitely gorgeous there. In this case, we were pretty food centric because we were at one of the top Michelin-starred restaurants in the world, which happens to be gluten-free.
Oh, wow.
And so I can eat there. And so
Did you hear that, everyone out there? It's gluten-free.
Gluten-free, yeah. So, we ate our shot list, needless to say.
Great.
So that was really kind of the crux of the book. But there's also a lot of landscape architecture, kind of some of the restaurant interiors and exteriors in the book. I think for most of us in movies, we've seen, the Provence countryside so much. So that's
what I'm thinking
book.
of. I think of this really romantic,
Very quaint
countryside. I don't know why I only see it at golden hour for some reason.
I could only see it in movies.
Yeah, that's probably why.
Is it like that, Jill?
Yeah,
Do you feel like you're in a movie?
You kind of do, actually. It's like the movie A Good Year. I don't know if you remember that, but
I think so.
The
Yes.
vineyards, the sunset, the lavender fields.
Why do I think you have a wicker basket or something with fruit, fresh fruit?
Dressed in wicker.
Exactly.
Right.
So I think the real question is, why are you back here? Why aren't you still there?
Yes,
Right.
well.
That's why she's going back.
Right.
She has to go back.
So you mentioned that you were shooting for your book.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, when you go there, do you know what you want to shoot for the book? Like, do you have a shot list? Are you capturing, a lot of imagery, a lot of content? And when you get back to the States, you're like, oh my, I have all this great content. Here's the style of book I want to do.
We knew in advance, we had a pretty good idea of what we want to shoot. And with all books, it kind of works like this. We put together a shot list, shoot as much as we possibly can around the subject. So for this book, we knew we were doing the bistro classics. We were doing the Michelin star portion of the restaurant, so the fine dining dishes.
Sounds like an awful shoot already.
It does, yeah.
Hopefully you got to taste
the
some of
landscape,
the food.
the landscape, shooting a lot of the ingredients. Provence is known for, farm to table cuisine. And so a lot of those ingredients were key shots. And then just as well as the landscape, the architecture, the interiors and exteriors of the property were stunning as well. So we knew we wanted to include all of that. And in this case, we have to, typically with books, you have to work quite quickly when you're on location, especially if you're doing anything around restaurants, chefs, and the hospitality industry, because you can't overtake the place. You have to work
Right.
around
I'm sure
things.
it's dictated on their schedules and what they're doing.
Absolutely. And in this case, we were worried. You're always worried with the book. Like, do you have enough content? When we got back, we had probably enough content for 3 books.
Oh my gosh.
So there was so much. The hardest part was
happy. Just going.
exactly all those gluten-free desserts. They have a lot of energy.
Right.
So we actually had 2. So the hardest part of this particular book for me was just taking things out. We had to edit down to get to the right page count. But yeah, we have a pretty good idea for a shot list. But books always take on a life of their own. So you kind of go in with the most planning that you can do. But when it comes to actually putting together the layout, it usually kind of takes on its own story through the imagery and through the content. So it's just being, having a big enough plan in place, but then also being adaptable enough to let the story come through in the medium that you have it. In this case, since it's very visual, it has to be able to tell the story visually.
Yeah.
And so editing to that. But
So when you're traveling and you're shooting, for a book with culinary kind of theme in mind, is there, when you pick out your locations, do you think like there's better parts of the world that have better cuisine, that would lend themselves better to being shot and captured, through the lens of your camera, or do you just kind of find the location and then hope that you can find a Michelin-rated restaurant, or kind of how does that work?
Well, certainly for the Michelin-star restaurants, that is definitely a planned shoot. So that's reaching out in advance, setting things up. That usually takes, in this case, it took a couple of months to kind of set that up with the restaurant. If it was, say, a general book about food, I think there are definitely regions of the world that are more known for food.
For sure.
When it comes to actually photographing food, the food needs to be styled.
Mm-hmm.
So the higher end restaurants, presentation and plating is a big part of what they do.
Right.
So it lends itself to a book format. If you were doing, say, street food in Thailand, that would be another option. It would be a very different type of shoot, though. It would be a little more run and gun, and you'd have a food stylist on set, like getting things from the different stalls. Sam and Kevin, you both would be great candidates for this job. Getting things ready and putting it together.
I was already convinced, like at the beginning.
Yeah.
So what was the best thing you ate? It might be hard, but what was the best thing?
Can you really narrow it down?
Right.
It's pretty tough, but I have to say for me, the gluten-free pastry, French-style pastry, that's something that, here we have a lot of, gluten-free desserts and things, but there to have French-style pastry gluten-free is a very, very rare. Like, this is probably the only restaurant in the world that does it.
It's art in itself, finding a way to make pastry gluten-free.
Right. Yeah,
So
the pastry puff gluten-free was like
pastry puff.
pretty amazing, especially in the rest, because the rest of France has amazing food, but it is a little bit hard to eat. I'm gluten and dairy free, so it's a little bit. I wouldn't say it's hard, but it's, you're a little more limited in other places. So being at this particular Michelin-star restaurant, eating that level of food and being able to eat anything off the menu was pretty spectacular.
I think that's a great point. Do you find that as a challenge when you travel because you are gluten-free and dairy-free? Because I know probably a lot of our West Coast listeners, have the same kind of challenges when they travel. Does that make your travels any more difficult, or do you just have to plan ahead? What's your take on that when you travel?
For the majority of places, it's really not an issue. There are plenty of options. And I would say outside of the U.S. and certainly Western Europe, most places aren't gluten-heavy. Most countries don't have gluten-heavy cuisines. So for me, it's relatively easy. I do plan, like I bring, meal replacement bars and drinks and things, but it's usually not a big issue. And I think dietary restrictions, it's something that you see, that I've noticed traveling over the last couple of years, almost everywhere you go, especially high-end hospitality. They've become very adept at catering to all those things, because most people on some level have restrictions or preferences, and that's just a part of global travel. I mean, you can't, You change and you want to adapt, and you enjoy everything the destination has to offer, but there are some modifications that people need to make.
Do you think social media plays a hand in that at all? Because we're such a visual kind of society now, and with the advent of social media and Instagrams and things like that, it's so much easier now to show these exotic locations or just different locations. And so for tourism in general, do a lot of these places, you think, have to be conscientious of their traveler and be, more adaptable to be able to cater to what the traveler needs?
Absolutely. And I think part of offering great hospitality is being aware of what the consumer wants, and also helping kind of package local food in a way that, tourists and foreigners can enjoy it and understand what it is.
And not intimidated by it.
Right.
Something recognizable, but still, you still feel like you are involving yourself in the culture of the country. Yeah. I think that's really important. That's why I was like, what is the best thing that you ate out there? So cost-wise, what does it take? You mentioned there's Airbnb that you had stayed at before, right? And then, so food, souvenirs, where you stayed, travel, transportation, cost-wise, what was it like?
So
did you plan ahead? Ahead?
Europe in general is kind of interesting when you look at cost-wise, because you can get, especially from, we're based in Los Angeles, but you can get amazing flights from the major U.S. cities at different times of year. It's just a matter of watching it. So I think if you want to do something on a budget, say to Provence, it's very, very possible. If you're not flexible on the time of year you're going, that can make a huge difference on airfare. So for, say, an economy, a coach class ticket, it can be anywhere from I got one as low as $450,
Wow.
all the way, it can go all the way up to $2,000, like if you're going at a ticket. So there's a huge variation. And same thing, there's tons of, France has great bed and breakfast, there's Airbnb options, there's hotels, and the same thing there. If you book early, because those places, particularly in more popular destinations like Provence, they book up very quickly. The good places, because it's a place people also go back to year after year, so they have a lot of repeat business. But if you book early on those, you can get very good deals in Provence. And then food, it just depends. Obviously, if you're eating at Michelin-starred restaurants, your budget goes pretty far up.
Expensive than the fast food chain.
But the great thing about France is if you fall down the street and you trip, you're going to land in a good restaurant. There's not really bad food in France, and they have amazing markets, particularly in Provence. There's a market in Lumeron that's quite famous. They have fresh figs in fall and artichokes, and they go through their season. So you have lots of options and variants on budget, but it's absolutely possible to do it on a budget if you're open to kind of the timing, if you're a little bit flexible on the timing that you're going, and just booking far enough in advance.
Was there anything that surprised you about Provence that you just weren't ready for or took you aback?
One of the things that actually surprised me about it is I'm, used to traveling in Europe. I've spent a lot of time there, and everything is so accessible by train and public transportation. So one of the things about Provence that did surprise me was that it's not as public transportation accessible when you're in the countryside. So within Marseille and within Aix-en-Provence, you can certainly get to other major cities in the country, but actually getting around the region, I was surprised at how driving dependent it is. There aren't really, I'm sure there are buses to kind of random places, but it's not a particularly easy place to get around if you're going to some of the smaller towns or from place to place. And taxis are, there's Uber in Marseille, but there's not,
no
taxi
bird
service.
scooters.
No bird scooters. Yeah, there isn't. You can get taxis, but it's somewhat of an effort and pretty costly to order taxis outside of the major cities.
So what would you say were your top 3 highlights from Provence? It could be any of the times you went there, but what are the top 3?
Ooh, that's tough.
She's like food, and
Right.
Food. Yeah, no, that's I know.
Restaurant.
Right. I'm trying to think of something that isn't food, but I would say food. It is really the food experience there, the food driving around in the countryside. So the Michelin-starred restaurant that we shot at La Fenière, the food was absolutely amazing. We also visited, Alain Decausse has a restaurant in Moustier called Le Pastis de Moustier, which is absolutely amazing. They have a helicopter pad, so you can, in theory, fly your helicopter and land there. And visiting that restaurant was
useful to know. Good to know.
It's pretty profound.
Yeah.
And I think just driving through the countryside, finding all the, there's all these little towns. There's so much history in that region, and there's just a level of depth and kind of navigating your way around the country roads and region and coming across new sites and new things it's really fun.
It sounds exciting.
Right.
Yeah.
So now that I have this vision of like the golden hour wicker basket situation, what would you say are your packing tips? Going to Provence, France during this time of the year?
So during this time of the year, so in September, it's still usually pretty warm. A good thing to do is a weather check because it is a time of year where things can kind of change. They go from still quite warm, like high 80s, down to like the 70s and cooling down during the day. So definitely, I definitely recommend packing in layers. So having like a light wool kind of cover up sweater, nice outerwear like jackets, just so you can kind of take it up and down a notch depending on the weather. The last couple of times I've been there, it was quite hot. So also being prepared for the warmer weather too. And I think layers are just an easy way to pack to kind of get around having to pack for 2 totally separate seasons.
Yeah, no, it's extremely useful information, I think, to know.
Right. So, speaking of, let's get into Jill's packing hack of the
day.
Let's hear it, Jill. We want to know.
Yeah, because you travel so often, you got to have some hacks, right?
Right.
So I think, throughout this podcast series, we would love to know some of those little tidbits that you might know of or have little tricks that some people might not know. So for Provence, as it relates to, were there any hacks that you used or, things that you can provide the listener?
Yes. So my packing hack of the day is actually regarding shoes. And this is for packing carry-on only. And I know this is tough, especially for, well, I shouldn't say just the ladies out there, but because I know a lot of men that have
I have a lot of
shoes.
shoes.
Yes, yeah, the
I'm a
one
bit
sitting
of a
across from me.
Sneakerhead.
But I really try to limit shoes to 2 pairs.
Okay, so I can't go. I can't
Yeah,
go.
yeah, you
No,
can't
you
go to
can't.
Provence.
Sorry. Nope.
You don't have to, but I find that, and first of all, both have to be somewhat walking. They have to both be walkable.
Okay.
Particularly in Provence, if you're, on cobblestone streets, you don't want to be in, your Louboutins. They will get ripped up in 2 minutes. So having two pairs of shoes that are both, you can walk in, one a little bit dressier for evenings out, and then one just great pair of, day walking shoes, something that you're comfortable spending the whole day in. But I think shoes tend to take up the most amount of space, and I think it's usually wasted space. Oftentimes when I've traveled, with 4 or 5 shoes, you don't end up wearing, usually more than 2. You kind of get used to the ones you have. So I think eliminating that, making that decision before you leave will help save space and save weight in your luggage.
Awesome. Definitely useful tips. Good to know.
Well, thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
So exciting. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Carry On Only.
Thanks for listening to Carry On Only, dedicated to inspiring your next global adventure. Listen to Jill take you around the world in style, live every week right here or 24/7 on demand at starworldwidenetworks.com. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. For immediate access to Jill's destination guides, blog, and show notes, please visit jillpater.com and follow her on Instagram at Jill Pater.